put the meeting on the calendar for a month out that says by this date, this will have happened. We're going to have the meeting that day, and it's either going to be to look back at what we got done or to course correct, or we're all going to come in and have to admit we haven't hit the target.
Hello, this is Shirley Kavanagh, and you are very welcome to the Leadership Discoveries podcast. Here I chat with leaders and experts across a variety of sectors and geographies who share their experience and views on a range of leadership topics. And I'm delighted to welcome back Dean McAlister, who is a regular contributor now to the Leadership Discoveries podcast. Dean is Executive Vice President at Inizio Biotech, based in the US, but with very much a global remit and perspective. Dean, you're very welcome again.
Thank you for having me. Proud to be an alumnus of your wonderful podcast.
That's great. Dean, as we look back on one year and start another, it's an opportune time for leaders to reflect, but obviously to look forward as well. And in 2025, I don't think has disappointed in terms of complexity and leadership challenges that are there. Whether it's trade fragmentation, tariffs, policy uncertainty, AI acceleration, the adoption challenges that come with that, capability gaps. And then we have a lot going on in terms of rate path uncertainty, uneven inflation. And on top of that, we've got geopolitical uncertainty, just to name a few. And there are many, many more. How do leaders prepare themselves to lead in that type of environment? How do they build that competence?
After hearing that tale of woe, I'm reminded of one of my favorite lines, which is to say, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like the second half of the play?
Yes.
So we often find ourselves in situations that are unpredictable. And the only thing you can really count on is that you will have unpredictability. And that requires the leader to be very agile. But there are moments where you get a little bit of time for reflection. And I do find at the end of a year, when it finally does arrive, because sometimes that's delayed, and you feel like people are putting 10 pounds of sugar through a 5-pound sack just to get things done right before the holiday, right? Everybody wants to talk to you. Everybody wants to spend their budget money. These are all good things, signs of life in any market, in any organization. But you catch yourself sometimes going, when is it actually going to be the finish line? And I get to tap out and have some time to reflect. Then I think about reflection through the lens of how you're wired as a leader. And I know myself well at this point, after all these years in the professional environment in biopharma. I am wired being an activator. It's one of my top 5 strengths from StrengthsFinder, which I definitely espouse. StrengthsFinder, knowing yourself. So sometimes I have to activate around reflection. It's not a natural skill that you would think an activator who wants to be doing the next thing, not looking backwards, you're looking forwards. But sometimes I have to almost play a mental game with myself to say, well, let's activate around reflection. And I'm also a maximizer, so I rate limit it and say, okay, for the next 5 minutes, I'm going to activate on reflection, and at least forces me to stop and pause and think about what I might want to continue and what I might want to stop also. And I think that that's what this podcast affords us today, is to start looking at how the leader can actually have a degree of reflection, but not so much so that you are looking in the rear view mirror for too long. Because if you think about in your automobile, if you are driving while looking in the rear view mirror, you will have a wreck. That mirror is probably 5% of the space of your front window for a reason. You should have 95%. That's about looking forward. So I think today, as we focus on this, there is a little bit of reflection, and that's important because you want to learn from that. But it should be with a forward focus.
Yeah. And I know my own practice when I talk to people, talk to leaders, Dean, that reflection piece can be very, very difficult to do, to find the space for it and even the techniques around it. Because, people are so caught in the moment, or as you say, caught in the activity of doing things. So how, what's your best advice for leaders? Because it is about growth as well. When we reflect, it's about growing. And understanding what we're good at and understand, because you just said there, what are the things you want to stop doing as such. So how do leaders actually do that? How do they keep that forefront?
Well, one of the things to remember is that, as John Wooden said, who coached UCLA basketball teams when they won many of the NCAA titles in the 1960s and 70s, he said, activity does not equal accomplishment.
Hmm.
So therefore, you have to go, well, the activity has to be towards something. So the activity around pausing needs to be looking back to say, what have I learned this year that can help me to be better this next year and to grow in what I call conscious competence,
Hmm.
to be able to have another point that I can draw on that has been consciously processed in cognition and go from the theory of something that happened or maybe happened to me over to the application and practice of saying, I know that about myself. I know how to use that again and to employ it with conscious competence for what might be ahead.
Hmm. And, in that model, that sort of theoretical model, from conscious competence to unconscious competence, let's say, and somewhere along that continuum, there are blind spots. And when you look back, let's say, on the past year and just interactions that you may have had with many organizations at this stage, many leaders, where do you think the blind spots can be?
Well, I think the blind spots can be presuming that you understand something at a depth level that actually requires more study. I believe that artificial intelligence is causing people to not think deeply enough
Hmm.
and it catches up to them because sometimes you're asked a question in a company meeting, an executive setting, maybe a question and answer with your team when they're all together for a town hall meeting. And you can't go, let me run an AI query real
Hmm.
time here before I answer that question. So leaders can sometimes be caught short because they believe there are shortcuts. And it should be augmented intelligence, not artificial.
Mm.
There's no one who's saying you shouldn't use those things to prepare. And I think the future belongs to people who use AI well, but don't allow AI to do their jobs for them, to do the thinking that should be required for them, and to, in essence, be the delegated part of their cognition. So
Hmm.
that is the trap that people can fall into. And I've seen that over this past year. There's been times when I have been preparing for meetings and applying a principle that I believe in firmly, which is just do the next thing well. But sometimes I have thought I could have a shortcut by just saying, well, let me run an AI query about this client that I'm meeting with for the first time, someone we want to work with us, and realize as I get into that that there are complexities in their business, maybe in the supply chain, maybe in things you mentioned about how they're having to choose on most favored nation principles around, hey, we better launch in the US first,
Hmm.
or we run the risk of our pricing being upside down later. And these are watershed moments for companies. They're going to be at pivotal moments where they are going to choose a path that they cannot go back from. And I owe them more than that. So I have learned myself this year that AI should be an enabler, but it is not a crutch as the leader.
And that sort of combination, isn't it, of the human tech piece as such? I'm taken by just some of the things you're talking about there, in terms of that interaction with clients, for instance, where although the algorithm may be telling you to take a particular path or whatever, but because of this interaction that you have, that you see something different. What's that skill?
That is a conscious competence skill. Actually, Shirley, I believe that is a muscle that can be honed and developed. It's a flexibility. And what I mean by conscious competence is probably contrasted best by looking at the opposite principle, which would be unconscious competence.
Hmm.
And looking back to my career leading large teams at AstraZeneca, I think unknowingly I spent way too many years, perhaps, in unconscious competence, where I was just in automatic mode
Hmm.
on how I led, how I enacted things, how I managed personnel policies, development of individuals. And I don't think I realized what it meant to be consciously competent. So, what's a practical example of that? So, pick your favorite sporting event. Let's use American football, since we're in the throes of that here in the US, here as the playoffs are starting to take shape. The Kansas City Chiefs are not going to be in the playoffs. You know, that's news alone. But I think about conscious competence is knowing the game you're in while you're still in the game and still call a play. Like, what I mean by that is, you know, you have a great halftime locker room discussion. The coach gives you all of that, but then you got to go out on the field. Then you're the quarterback. You've got a play that you've called, but then you go to the line of scrimmage and look across and you see that the defense is calling a blitz, and that does not line
Hmm.
up with the play you just called. So you have to call an audible, right? And it's in that moment where you're either going to be an ill equipped leader, or if you've done your homework, study the game film, not just dependent on AI, but you've actually built in the experience base to say, hey, I think I know what they're going to do. And I know what these other 10 people and me on this side of the line of scrimmage need to do. And so then you call the audible because you've practiced it before. Yes, it's an audible, but it's a play that you've practiced. So my point with all this is all that lends to preparation, and it lends to knowing what you're trying to do, what the likely outcome is, and how you as a leader need to be consciously competent in that moment. And that's what I think the call of leadership actually is for seasoned leaders, particularly those who have been at the craft for a while. You should be consciously competent, not unconsciously competent, where you're good at something, but you don't know why. Because if you're
Hmm.
good at something and you know why, then you can call upon that at a moment's notice and be more productive real time when the market is demanding that you be agile and adaptable.
And just to that point around adaptability, does that come with experience, or is that something that people need to, dare I say, consciously work on? That working in this very uncertain environment that we have at the moment.
Well, it's a learned skill, not that you plan your spontaneity, but you
Mm,
do have some things that are learned skills. And there was a recent HBR article that looked at 3 points around
mm,
adaptability, called Being Adaptable Isn't Enough. They make a posit that you have to be agile, you have to be resilient, and you have to have foresight. Those are three things that are somewhat learned. Yes, there's some of them that are on the job training, is how you learn. Yes. But there are things that you can put yourself into looking at case studies around
yeah.
how have people pivoted. HBR has case examples galore about how leaders react to things. And I believe that it's in helping to train yourself to be adaptable through those principles that you can actually be more effective. Well, what does that mean though? First, you as the leader have to know yourself. You have to be absolutely clear on what your strengths are. I think Strength Finder calls those the balcony strengths, the things that give you energy, which for me is activator, maximizer, belief, responsibility, significance. I'm at my best when I'm starting something new, making the most of it. I believe in it, I'm responsible for it, and I can do it at scale. That has been the job I'm in for the past 5 years. I have the privilege of getting to do that. And I'm going into year 5 of the job, and I'm still thinking about what are the things that I'm learning? How can I be more effective? How can I shorten the distance between learn and apply? How can I get our business, which is a services business in pharma, to yes or no sooner through my contacts to be more efficient, to be able to look at that? So, yes, you have to be adaptable, but these 3 points that they make about how to be more adaptable are learned skills.
Mhm. And it's interesting, just on that foresight point you talk about. About 2 years ago, I did some work with people from Trinity Business School, and we wrote an article around it. And we looked at top universities across the globe, and foresight was actually one of the things that MBA students were not learning enough about, actually. And it was interesting. Now, I think things have changed, but certainly at that time, just post COVID, that was something that there wasn't enough preparation for people around that. So I think it's really interesting we're talking about foresight. Dean, one of the things that a lot of what you're talking about there is, acknowledging, let's say, our own areas for development. I think we also know that as leaders make their way up through the organization, they get further away often from feedback and from hearing honest feedback from others. We also often see ego play more of a part at that level in an organization. How does that piece, the ego piece, although there are positives from an ego perspective as well, but just where it becomes a negative, how can leaders watch that piece for themselves, where the ego gets in the way, quite frankly?
There's a clear difference between self-confidence and egotistical behavior. And that's important to remember because the market is the leveler of all this. I've seen people who were overconfident to the point of letting their ego run the show. Those people, the market settles that matter very quickly. I no longer worry about that. If I see someone that tends to be a little egotistical, there was a time in my life when I would try and go after that and make that right or somehow show that the person was wrong. I'm not the boss of them. I'm not the judge of them. It's not my responsibility to do that. My responsibility is to enact the best possible service for our clients that I can do. You have to know what your job is. If I was leading that person, that's a different matter, but I'm not, right? I think sometimes we take on things unnecessarily as leaders, believing we have to lead on everything. You don't. You just have to lead on a few things. And quite honestly, what I realize the older I get is that most things in life, you just have to be threshold competence and you
Mm-hmm.
have to be better than threshold at just a few things. You can't really be sub threshold on very many things, maybe one or two. That's where I go back to the basement strengths that are mentioned in Strength Finder. Some of those things probably you should stay away from. I completely understand that. But most things you can come back and say, I just have to hit the mark. So, what are my remits? What am I responsible to do? And really understanding and knowing that. And some of that goes back to this reflection points. Look back over this past year and see across the key things that your organization says are important for the job that you're in. There should
Mm-hmm.
be a job description. Maybe go back and read it and look and say, okay, that seems to be 4 or 5 things here that the organization says are really important. How am I doing against those things? Because those should be what you cover in your write up for your review.
Yeah.
My purpose is I had one big central point that I was responsible for. It was delivering a certain forecasted amount. So that's all I focused on the whole year was that. And that allowed me to deliver back an organizational result that was actually above threshold there. Well, why was that? Because I never lost sight of that goal. Our CRM helped me to make sure I never lost sight of that goal, but also I established a cadence of review upline in the organization with others auditing my performance against subjective standards and something that was clearly quantifiable. So I think you look back and say, okay, why was I consciously competent in that? Because I had a clear goal. I had reviews and steps toward that. I knew what my leading indicators were toward goal attainment, like going to conferences. That's how I'm going to find new client acquisition. I'm going to find the contacts that I need to make things happen. There's going to be a scoreboard. How did I do against it? There's a clear cadence of accountability. All of those things allow me to be consciously competent. So my point is, as you look back, find those threads of conscious competence. Notice nowhere in there did I go back to an inflated view of myself, because an inflated view of myself in any of that, or being defensive whenever someone else is objectively evaluating my performance, would lead to me being a hollow, egomaniacal leader. And I guarantee that the market would sort that out really fast and I would not be as effective, and therefore I would not be in role. So
Mm-hmm.
those things take care of themselves. But the consciously competent leaders are able to look back and see what is it that led me to the point of success, and then also what behaviors led me to a point where I had a gap. And do I need to fill that gap? If so, then when you're looking forward now, you go, okay, let's put some things in place that are safeguards, guardrails to ensure that I at least close that delta in what I need to have happen. And to me, that is the bridge between reflection and the responsibility for where you're going in the new year.
I'm sensing this laser focus on what needs to be achieved. So because of the, the environment that you work in and the discipline that you work in, you've got a lot of hard measures, I suppose. You've got hard targets. You can see the target very, very clearly. So how does what you've just said there translate into other functions or other activities that may be serving you, let's say, from an internal perspective? Does it translate the same way, do you think?
I think it still can, because in any type of organizational role, there are performance measures of some kind. There's something that looks at KPIs for the job that are usually time bound and focused. Perhaps you have to execute an internal project by X date. Well, that is a KPI. And you can put things in place that allow you to objectively assess how has that gone. And there are leading indicators then against making sure that you achieve those things. So if you're setting a time and event schedule in motion, which any job would have, then there should be milestones where you hit certain things. They have to happen by this date. And most organizations fall apart whenever somebody doesn't use dates as events to
Mhm.
say by this date, this will have happened. I used to do this in preparation for large payer meetings when I ran the corporate accounts team at AstraZeneca. I would know we'd have a big contract renewal coming up for one of our large brands. And these were multi-billion-dollar brands with some very large customers. And I would set artificial dates that say, okay, by this date, we will have a meeting with the client, the customer, about what we're looking at for renewal. We will either go into that meeting and say, I have absolutely nothing to say, or we will go into that meeting with content. And then people knew that I meant it, that I was setting the meeting with the customer. So this is a key trick, I think, even on internal things. Put the meeting on the calendar for a month out that says, by this date, this will have happened. Invite the people to it. They see what the title of the meeting is, all those things. We're going to have the meeting that day, and it's either going to be to look back at what we got done and how we're on track, or to course correct, or we're all going to come in and have to admit we haven't hit the target. One way or the other, you're using an event to ensure that something has happened. And I think that's the crux to the answer of your question, is regardless of what your remit is in an organization, use time and events in your favor.
It can be very hard when things have not gone well and you have that event, let's say, and you're looking back at something that actually hasn't been entirely positive. So, how does that work when you have people in the room like that and maybe progress hasn't been to where it should have been? What does that meeting look like?
Well, I think first you have to point out the consequences of the lack of progress. It's not just that something didn't happen. It's, well, why didn't it happen? And what are the consequences of the fact that it didn't happen? So you begin to then look out to whatever the end state is that you're having the project for in the first place. We're trying to accomplish a new operating system in our company, a new way of working, whatever it may be. Maybe you're 2 months away from that at the point that you hit this failure meeting, if you will.
Mhm.
That's when you can have a course correction. But I did a whole podcast once on failure as a step to success.
Mm,
So you have to take a step back and say, well, we're at halftime, and thus far we have failed. And somebody has to
mm,
call that out. Often in corporate environments, people are afraid to actually say the truth. And I worked in AstraZeneca for 28 years, and I found that often there was groupthink in meetings where nobody wants to actually say the truth. So you end up saying euphemisms for the truth, or you end up making up something that actually didn't happen. And I found it was often my role to, when people were being too rose colored glasses of a view of things and making statements, I would use the phrase, I do not agree with what you just said, and let that sit there. And it's uncomfortable, but it's
mhm.
in those uncomfortable moments is when we grow. And if people know your heart on the matter and you have some relationship equity with people, they'll go, this is someone that I respect, care about. And clearly, he's pointing out that we're off track. And someone has to say that. And I think it's the leader that has to care enough that you don't care if you
Mhm.
actually ruffle the feathers for a few minutes, push somebody out on the ledge a little bit, because you can bring them back in. You make your point and then you bring people back together. And that to me is the call of leadership. And it's a conscious competence point too, is to say, I'm doing this and I know what I'm doing. I'm not saying these things flippantly, and I'm saying it because I care and I want to
Mhm.
see us hit the mark. We're at halftime. We have a chance to change the way the second half of the project goes. Now let's talk about how to do that. So see, you create this moment where like all of a sudden people sit up straighter and they go like, oh, he may be right. What behaviors do we need to change? Then you course correct. But you have to have a time interval in there. So if you're running a 90-day project, you can't say on day 89, we're going to evaluate how it's gone. You need something perhaps day 30, day 60, day 90. That's why people talk about 90-day plans. It's just to get you moving against something that's got some clarity in between day 1 and day 90.
And Dean, I'm again listening to you. It's kind of very much being prepared to step up into that leadership moment, isn't it? You don't know when the leadership moment is going to arise. It may not be your meeting. You may not be the most senior person in the room, but it's being prepared, which strikes me about it's about courage, isn't it? The courage to actually say things.
It's courage, but the courage comes from preparation.
Hmm.
And any confidence that you have comes from knowing you're doing something for the right reason. You're doing it with an intent. You're doing it with a degree of rational thought. It's not emotion. It's not a rah rah speech. Or similarly, it's not like back in the 1950s, Nikita Khrushchev going in the UN and slamming his shoe on the table, saying, we will crush you. It's not about that. That goes back to the egotistical, egomaniacal, I would argue, leader, caustic leadership. No, I used to tell people, I'm going to kick your butt with my heart. And they would look and, what? What do you mean? Look back at you like a cow looking at a new gate. Like, what? But you go, just think about that for a second. I care so much that I care enough to say the things that need to be said,
Hmm.
right? And then people begin to take a step back and go like, all right, take the emotion down a notch. Let's look at this objectively and rationally. But the leader has to create a moment. And that's what we're called to do. And my point is, when you create those moments, you're creating them out of conscious competence, not just some flippant emotional reaction like an amygdala hijack. No, it's got to be something where you're doing this and saying, I know what I'm doing. I'm doing this intentionally because I'm trying to get you to think. Sometimes I would tell people, hear me now and listen later, because they're not ready for it yet. I go like, just absorb this for a minute. Go away and think about it because they have their own strength set that they need to process this through. Let them process it and say, okay, I want you to hear me now and listen later. 2 days from now, we're going to set up another time to talk through what we've just had in this meeting where we've said we're not on track. Right. So then the leader sets the tone, the leader sets the cadence, the leader sets the vision. And remember, everything should be values, vision, strategy, tactics, in that order. So if you are doing something like this, it needs to be in line with your organizational values. Many organizations have some value about do the hard right thing, or, we will say what needs to be said, whatever it is, go back to
Hmm.
that. That's your safe
Yeah.
harbor. Like I'm acting this way as the leader in this moment because it is in line with this value. And for us to achieve our vision of whatever it is, I have to live out that value, which will then lead us to the vision, to the strategy, and that's choosing what we're going to do and what we're not going to do, and then the tactics. Not just go right to the tactics, it needs to make sure it goes in that orchestration. And then you frame this as the leader and you have a chance to be very effective in that
Mm.
regard. But you're effective because you're consciously competent, which requires preparation, it requires reflection, but it also requires action because there will come a critical moment where you're in that meeting. You may not be the senior person, but you go, I need to say something.
Yeah.
And you're either going to say it and respect yourself, or you're not
Hmm.
going to say it and you're going to look yourself in the mirror the next day and say, I sold out.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that's a great point. I've spoken to a lot of people who've actually said, "I wished I'd said something," and the moment is gone. And hopefully you hope that people learn from that. Dean, as we bring this conversation to a close, I'm going to misquote you here, but it's a line I really like. Be ready for the next challenge. It wasn't that. What was your line? Is be ready for the next step, is it? Because I think that's a great line for people to think about, because sometimes we can over engineer things, can't we? Rather than just, let's think of the next step.
We do. And sometimes people believe that if you move on something relatively quickly, that you haven't thought it through. I'm not trying to say in preparation that you need to go back through this over engineered, over orchestrated preparation set. Because if you think about it, if you've been in leadership for a while, you have this muscle that you have already cultivated and developed that's operating kind of at a substrata level about you as leader. And there's times when the leader has to act quickly, right? If
Hmm.
there's a fire in the building, we are not going to have a committee meeting about how to get out of the building. Somebody's going to go, follow me to freedom. Here we
Yes.
go. Let's go, right? That's who I want to follow. Or maybe that's me. I'm going to be in that situation. So you have to be able to say, I'm going to be confident enough as I've grown as a leader that I'm going to act responsibly, but quickly. And we're going to move. So this is where you have to say, okay, someone's got to lead. I'm going to be the leader. I'm going to set the tone. It doesn't mean you have to lead on everything. You choose on the things that you're going to lead on. Pick the most important things. That's part of this reflecting and looking ahead. Think about 2026. What are the things that I really need to lead around in my organization? And do I need to get better at them? And incrementally make sure that by the end of 2026, you'll be reflecting back and say, I grew on those things this year, but they have to be things that you can grow on. There are some things I will never be good at, and I do
Mhm.
not need to focus on them because I will be wasting my time. That's why I believe Strength Finder is the fuel to help you know what you can actually tap into the reserve and say, hey, I know if I go back and I lead around my responsibility strength, I lead around my activator strength, I've got a great chance of success because that's a muscle for me that is well developed, but it's got to be towards something. So you
Yeah.
think about, well, what is it that I want said about me at the end of 2026? Whatever that is, use your strengths to go toward that with conscious competence so that you are growing as a leader and then you never look back.
That's a great way to end this conversation, Jean. Very much around know thyself, really, isn't it? But listen, thank you so much again for joining me. I love our conversations, and some great advice, and as usual, some great nuggets of wisdom there as well. Dean, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me today.